This video is brought to you by Squarespace, the all-in-one website platform. More about them later in this video. The papacy, one of the oldest and most respected institutions in the world. For over 1,000 years, the Pope has been not only the spiritual leader of all Roman Catholics, numbering some 1.3 billion people today, but also a powerful temporal figure who could make and unmake empires, crown kings, and rule over the destiny of millions. During the Renaissance, the papacy also stood for something darker, widespread corruption, as church officials sought to enrich themselves at the expense of their flock. No pope better epitomized the era, so the story goes, than Alexander VI, who has been consigned to history as the Borgia Pope. According to popular history, no pope has ever been more corrupt, as Alexander presided over the infamous Borgia family, whose crimes included murder, betrayal, even incest. Above all, they schemed and lusted after power to which nothing would stand in their way. With over 5 centuries elapsing since the time of his reign, Alexander is shrouded in as much myth as he is mystery. Just who was this man, who came from a minor Spanish noble family and rose to become the leader of the Catholic world? What drove him? Ambition, lust, or greed? Was he really as corrupt as they say he was, or was it hyperbole spread by his many enemies? Let's find out. I'm Cosmic Horror author Eric Malachite, and today's episode of Biographics was provided by Ben Edelman, so be sure to show him some love in the comments as you tell us who you think the worst pope in history is. Was it Alexander VI or someone else? Rodrigo de Borja was born on New Year's Day 1431 in the town of Zativa, some 60 kilometers south of Valencia. The Borgias were of the lesser nobility, though they told everyone that they were the descendants of kings, because why not? Their stock had risen in recent years thanks to the efforts of Rodrigo's uncle, Alonso, who became a trusted advisor to the King of Aragon, particularly skilled at diplomacy. Alonso rose within the Catholic Church hierarchy to the rank of cardinal, one of the princes of the church, who wielded enormous power both spiritually and temporally. The most important duty that the College of Cardinals performs is to elect a new pope from among their number when the previous pope dies. At the conclave of 1455 held to replace Nicholas V, the cardinals were deadlocked, and a compromise candidate was needed. To the surprise of many, the 76-year-old Cardinal de Borja, or Borgia as he was known in Italian, was elected, taking the papal name of Calixtus III. It was assumed that the old man, who was in poor health, would not reign long, and then the cardinals could hold another election. Calixtus now found himself surrounded by enemies, both inside and outside the church, that had installed him as pope to begin with. Most of the controversy surrounded his foreign birth. There was no rule stating that an Italian needed to reign as pope, but for many of the powerful families on the peninsula, the Orsini, the Medici, and the Sforza, among others, believed the papacy was their birthright. The papal administration, the Curia, was filled with their partisans, installed there by previous popes. The new pope needed allies, and who better to have his back than members of his own family? Nepotism. Yay. This was much to the benefit of Rodrigo Borgia, who was 24 years old when his uncle was elected pope. He'd already been the beneficiary of his uncle's generosity, being awarded clerical benefices that provided him income as well as an education at the prestigious University of Bologna. Now, the young man's star would truly rise thanks to Calixtus's new position. Along with his cousin Louis, Rodrigo was made a cardinal. His young age and the obvious favoritism would raise eyebrows today, but back then it was a matter of routine. So-called cardinal nephews appointed by the Pope were so common at the time that the word nepotism was invented to describe the practice. If you want your business to make more money than the Borgias, then you're going to need an awesome website. And the sponsor for today's video, Squarespace, has you covered. Squarespace is the all-in-one website platform, perfect for entrepreneurs with wares to sell, bloggers with a message to spread, and artists looking to reach the masses with their work. Whether you're just starting out or you're looking for a way to better manage your brand or gain power or influence in the Catholic Church, Squarespace makes it easy for you to create a beautiful professional website engage with your audience, and make sure the right people are getting your message. Squarespace's Fluid engine makes it easier than ever for pretty much anyone to dive in and make a beautiful website. Answer a few questions about the goals you'd like to accomplish with your site, choose a template, and get dragging and dropping elements onto your template. Drag and drop technology is also included in every Squarespace site. And now, introducing Design Intelligence, Squarespace's brand new service that combines 2 decades of industry-leading design expertise with cutting-edge AI technology to unlock your strongest creative potential. Design Intelligence empowers anyone to build a beautiful, more personalized website tailored to their unique needs and craft a bespoke digital identity to use across one's entire online presence. Best of all, if you're selling stuff on your website, you'll be able to offer a simple yet seamless checkout experience with Squarespace's powerful tools. You'll be able to accept credit cards, PayPal, Apple Pay, and in eligible countries, offer customers the option to buy now and pay later with Afterpay and ClearPay. Ready to get started? Check out squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/biographics to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Now, back to the video. A year after putting on his red robes, Rodrigo was appointed to the position of Vice-Chancellor of the College of Cardinals. This post was second only to the papacy in administrative power, as the Vice-Chancellor was charged with overseeing the day-to-day operations of the Curia, particularly in the assigning of clerical posts and the collection of money. Gotta get that tender. The opportunities to profit from the office were nearly endless, since all appointments passed through his office. Office seekers knew that getting on the Vice-Chancellor's good side was essential, which usually meant giving Cardinal Borgia a gift of money. Such practices had been going on within the church for centuries by this point. It was just considered the cost of doing business as opposed to, corruption. In 1458, however, Calixtus died and Borgia suddenly lost his chief sponsor. It would have been very easy for those in Rome who hated the so-called Catiline clique that Calixtus had surrounded himself with to move against Borgia at this point, since the new pope could very easily appoint one of his favorites to the vice-chancellorship once elected. However, Borgia was even more skilled at diplomatic maneuvering than his uncle had been, despite his young age. He was able to use his charm and skill to ensure that he played the role of kingmaker in the conclave of 1458, resulting in the election of Pius II as pope. As a reward, Borgia retained his lucrative and powerful position in the Vatican, and he would remain in the post of vice-chancellor for the next 35 years, not only for the duration of Pius II's papacy, but throughout the papacies of Paul II, Sixtus IV, and Innocent VIII as well. It was apparent to everyone, even his enemies, how good he was at his job, helping to shape church policy, acting as an indispensable advisor to the Pope, whoever he was, and raising vast sums when required for church business, and of course for himself too. He became one of the wealthiest men in Italy during his time as a cardinal. While Cardinal Borgia may have been playing the part of the dutiful church official publicly, his behavior in private left much to be desired from someone in his position. In particular, he struggled with the clerical vow of chastity that all Catholic priests, which of course included bishops, cardinals, and the Pope, were required by church doctrine to adhere to. Borgia fathered at least 8 children with 3 different women, and those are just the ones we know about. Once again, this was not unusual for men of his standing during this period. Quite a few cardinal nephews were actually illegitimate sons of the Pope. What was unusual was that Borgia, unlike his contemporaries, did little to keep his affairs private, openly raising his 4 children with his lover Vanozza de Catani in his Roman palace: Cesare, Juan, Lucrezia, and Geoffrey. In July 1492, Pope Innocent VIII died, and following the customary 2-week mourning period, the College of Cardinals gathered in the Vatican to elect his successor. This was the first conclave held in the Sistine Chapel, which has become the traditional site of the papal election, though the famous ceiling artwork by Michelangelo would not be painted until 1508. This was the 5th conclave attended by Rodrigo Borgia, and now, aged 61, he knew that this might be his last chance to attain the highest office in Christendom. He was thought to be one of the favorites in the previous election in 1484, but his ambitions had been blocked by a rival candidate, Giuliano della Rovere, The 48-year-old della Rovere, who was like Borgia a cardinal nephew being appointed by his uncle Sixtus IV, clashed with Borgia on church policies and on a personal level, with much of the younger cardinal's animosity coming from the fact that Borgia was Spanish, not Italian. Innocent VIII was a compromise candidate that both Borgia and della Rovere believed they could control. But now Innocent was dead, and both Borgia and della Rovere, along with Milanese Cardinal Ascanio Sforza, believed themselves to be top candidates in the hotly contested conclave of 1492. In the end, Borgia successfully outmaneuvered della Rovere, bringing Sforza's faction over to his side with the promise of the cardinal taking his old job of vice-chancellor. Della Rovere was furious at his defeat, and for the rest of his life considered the Borgias his enemies. He also let it be known that he believed Borgia only won because he had bribed the other cardinals into voting for him, which is probably true. But this was also just another example of Borgia being criticized for doing something his opponents were also doing. Della Rovere had been given a huge sum of money by French King Charles VIII in order to facilitate his own candidature. Borgia chose the papal name of Alexander VI, reportedly as a homage to Alexander the Great, the same way his son Cesare was named for Julius Caesar. Unlike his uncle, the new pope was popular with the Roman people who knew him from his longtime service as vice-chancellor. That popularity did not extend to the Italian nobility, however, many of whom carried the same anti-Spanish bias they'd carried against Calixtus III. So, like his predecessors, Alexander would build his support network using his familial connections. In 1493, he appointed 12 new members to the College of Cardinals, one of which was his own son, Cesare. Another was Alessandro Farnese, the older brother of Giulia Farnese, the Pope's considerably younger lover. Previous popes had given relatives red hats, of course, and previous popes had given them to a large number of individuals, but no one had ever appointed as many as Alexander had, and definitely not in such a short period of time. The previous record for a papacy was 8. It was a pattern that would continue to manifest itself throughout the entirety of Alexander's reign. He would do everything his predecessors had done, only bigger and more blatant. Giulia Farnese, who was only 16 years old when the 58-year-old Cardinal Borgia had fallen for her in 1490, was a perfect example. Alexander was hardly the first pope to carry on with women, or men for that matter, in defiance of the clerical vow to abstain from sex. But his predecessors had kept their affairs as quiet as possible. Alexander, on the other hand, moved her into his apartments in the Vatican alongside his family, leading the Roman public to jokingly dub her the Bride of Christ. Alexander believed it was his role as pope to keep the peace in the Italian peninsula, while always scheming behind the scenes to advance his family's interests wherever he could. Most of his grand plans centered around his children. As already mentioned, his eldest son Cesare was made a cardinal at the age of 18, putting him in position as the family's heir apparent. Second son Juan Borgia was given a Spanish dukedom and also made the commander, or gonfalonier, of the papal army. His daughter Lucrezia was married off 3 different times to Italian noblemen. The first was declared impotent, the marriage annulled. The second was murdered, probably at the orders of Cesare Borgia. And the third, Duke Alfonso of Ferrara, learned his lesson from the first 2 and kept himself and his wife as far away from Rome as possible. Who could blame the guy? Even his young son, Geoffrey, was brought into the action. At the age of 13, he was married to the older Sancha of Aragon, a member of the Neapolitan court. Apparently, Sancha did not find her boy husband to her liking. It is rumored she carried on numerous affairs, including with both of Geoffrey's brothers and his father, but never with Geoffrey himself. So it's just like Game of Thrones, right? Unless I'm misremembering it.
But women in our position must make the best of our circumstances.
Alexander needed to build this alliance because war was coming to Italy over the issue of who should control Naples. Both Spain and France, 2 of Europe's major powers, believed they had a legitimate claim to the Neapolitan crown, which tried to remain independent of both. Charles VIII of France decided to up the ante by invading Italy in 1494 at the head of an army of 25,000, including artillery that could be deployed in the field, which usually made quick work of any medieval Italian fortresses that opposed him. He conquered Naples, crowning himself king before marching his army back to France, sweeping aside Italian opposition in the process. It looked like a great victory, except almost as soon as he left, he lost control of Naples thanks to an army sent by Spanish King Ferdinand. Charles's invasion was an object lesson for Italy, particularly for Alexander. Prior to the invasion, the small Italian city-states had squabbled amongst themselves over petty grievances, allying with each other when one state got too powerful to preserve the status quo. This division, however, left them exposed to invasion from a powerful nation-state who could play the various factions off against each other. The obvious solution to everyone was for Italy to unite under a single banner. The problem was, who should hold that banner? Alexander believed that the obvious choice for that role was himself and his family. Alexander's dynastic ambitions took a serious hit in 1497 when his son Juan was murdered in Rome. Juan was his favorite, in spite of the fact that the young man was vain, arrogant, and worse, completely incompetent. He had badly mismanaged a campaign conducted by the papal army against the Orsini family, who had sided with France during the late invasion, leading to defeat and humiliation for the Borgias. Still, the Pope was devastated when his son's body was found riddled with stab wounds. No one was ever held responsible for the murder, leading to much speculation about who the culprit was. At the time, most of the suspicion fell on his older brother, Cesare. He stood the most to gain from Juan's death. There was a fierce sibling rivalry between the two, and Cesare resented being made to wear clerical robes by his father, while his younger brother got to be a soldier. With Juan's death, Cesare finally got his wish to resign his position as a cardinal and become the sword bearer for his family. If Cesare did conspire to murder his brother, historians are divided on whether he did or not. It would not be the first or last murder he was tied to. Much of the bad behavior that has been ascribed to the entire Borgia family can be laid at the feet of Cesare. At times, he could be an intelligent, tactical man in the mold of his father, but at other times he could behave quite irrationally, lashing out impetuously with violent consequences. He is believed to have harbored an obsession with his sister, Lucrezia, always acting with hostility towards her husbands or lovers, having at least 2 of them killed. However, there was no evidence to support the widely supported theory that the 2 of them were engaged in an incestuous relationship with each other, as it seems Lucrezia was more wary of her brother than loving. Part of Cesare's instability can be traced to illness. He had contracted what was known as the French disease. It would not get its proper name, syphilis, until 1530, in Naples soon after his brother's murder, and would carry the disease for the rest of his life, though most historians suspect his instability more closely resembles a personality disorder than as a result of syphilis. Still, Cesare was now the family's best hope for Alexander's dynastic plans, as the Pope made his son a duke and gave him an army to conquer the cities of Romagna, an area on Italy's northeastern coast that nominally was part of the Papal States, but in fact was controlled by petty warlords and noblemen who answered to no one but themselves. Cesare's campaigns in the Romagna were as successful as they were violent. The lords who opposed him, some of whom were only teenagers, usually ended up being imprisoned in Rome's Castel Sant'Angelo, the papal stronghold that doubled as a prison, where they were usually slowly tortured to death. Alexander's 2 worst faults as a leader were his continued willingness to overlook his son's excesses and his nearly insatiable greed. On the first score, there is no concrete evidence that the Pope ever had anyone murdered on his own initiative. Cesare, on the other hand, was a cold-hearted killer, and rather than rein him in, Alexander only enabled him. On the second score, Alexander had been extracting money from the people for his entire career. He'd practically made it an art form as vice-chancellor, but his efforts to obtain cash rose to new heights as Pope, particularly when he needed to raise funds to support Cesare's military campaigns. In one particularly shameful episode, the Pope welcomed thousands of Jewish refugees from Spain who were fleeing the Spanish Inquisition to set up homes and businesses within Rome's walls, only to turn around and rob them of all their possessions, turning over his wealth to his son to spend on his army. I don't care who you are, that's messed up. Another favorite tactic of his was to invalidate the wills of wealthy cardinals when they died, instead rerouting their assets to the Vatican. The year 1500 was particularly prosperous. It was a jubilee year, and millions of pilgrims from all over Europe made the journey to Rome in order to be pardoned of their sins. Alexander made sure that pardon came with a price tag, a practice known as selling indulgences. Another big one was simony, the selling of clerical offices to the highest bidder, as wealthy men from all over the continent were willing to pay huge sums to secure for themselves or their families influential church offices, which came with the potential for greater profit and influence. Once again, these were all sins that had been committed by previous popes, and popes after Alexander would also do so, leading in no small part to the Protestant Reformation beginning in the 1520s. But Alexander was determined to live by the creed, go big or go home, so he both engaged in it more often and was much more open about it. This has led to speculation by both clerical and secular historians about whether the leader of the Christian world actually believed in God. The unsatisfactory answer is that nobody is sure. He was diligent in practicing the required religious ceremonies of his office, and he always said the correct things, but what truly lay in his heart has been lost to history. Cesare, on the other hand, was open about his lack of belief, which was unusual even for a man who wasn't in charge of an army supposedly sent by the Vicar of Christ. In the end, it was Cesare's lack of subtlety and his instability that doomed his father's plans. Alexander knew he wouldn't live forever and tried to instill the same values that had gotten him where he was in his son, but when he died in 1503, likely of complications from malaria, the Borgia Empire quickly fell apart. Cesare was unable to keep his domains, as all of Italy turned on him, including the new Pope Julius II, none other than the Borgia's sworn enemy, Cardinal della Rovere. Cesare ended up being imprisoned in Spain for a time before staging a dramatic escape, only to be killed in battle during the siege of Vienna in 1507. He would serve as the primary case study in one of the most famous written works of the age, Machiavelli's The Prince. The dignity of Pope Alexander VI's office did not extend to his body. It had rapidly decomposed in the summer heat, becoming grossly deformed and bloated. Making matters worse, a fight during his funeral procession caused the body to be tipped into the street, and because nobody wanted to touch him, I mean, could you blame them? The late pontiff ended up being dragged to his eternal rest at the end of a rope. Pope Julius II was similarly disrespectful, forswearing the memory of his predecessor by calling him the evilest of men. But we have to ask the question, was he really? As we pointed out earlier, almost everything Alexander did had also been done by previous popes, and was a drop in the bucket compared to other contemporary heads of state. Julius II, who would earn the nickname the Warrior Pope, engaged in many of the same practices himself, finding that he liked the power that came with the office as much as Alexander had. It seems, in the end, that Rodrigo Borgia's Spanish birth had more to do with his posthumous damnation as the worst of the Renaissance popes than anything he did during his lifetime. With the exception of Adrian VI, a Dutch-born pontiff who reigned from 1522 to 1523, there would be no popes born outside of Italy from the death of Alexander VI until the election of the Polish John Paul II in 1978, a period of more than 450 years. Fair or not, this is the legacy of Pope Alexander VI, the Borgia Pope, where a heady mix of xenophobia and bizarre self-righteousness conspired to create one of the history's worst monsters. Looking at it objectively, though, you have to admire the Borgias' tenacity. In a hostile country surrounded by enemies, and for a brief moment, they rose to the very pinnacle of power in the Christian world, before losing it all in spectacular fashion. It is a remarkable rise and fall for a family over the course of a single lifetime, the kind of thing worthy of Shakespeare. And in any case, perhaps it is better to be remembered by eternity as a villain than to not be remembered at all. That, however, will leave you to decide. I hope you learned something today, and if you dug today's episode, be sure to deploy your likes, comment who you think the worst pope in history is, and be sure to subscribe and share this video with someone who loves learning about history. I'm Eric Malachite, and I'll see you next time, Space Cowboy.